Welcome everyone to today's webinar on painting clouds. It's a subject that finds its way into a lot of different landscapes and can be sometimes difficult to paint. There are a lot of complex shapes and a lot of complex edges. But what I'd like to do is to present a few principles today that will help simplify the process. So the first of these principles has to deal with the form of the cloud. I like to break the cloud down into three planes: the light, the halftone, and the shadow. The second principle would be cloud color, temperature, and chroma. How to mix our colors, how to recognize there's both the shadow and the light side, and how they differentiate from, say, the color of the sky. And lastly, emphasis on the sky motif. These are really design issues. Once we figure out how to render a cloud, now what do we do with it? How do we help it to function in the context of the bigger picture? So these three topics we'd like to go over. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the demo. Okay, so to get started today, we want to talk a little bit about our color chart here and gain an understanding of where the cloud colors sit with regard to the color wheel. So you can see here on all these charts down here, these are the complements of the primaries and secondaries, that these lightest values that have been tinted down most closely reflect some of the colors that we see here in the cloud and in the sky. You can see that the cloud is not quite this violet in terms of its shadow. These values here are right down here where violet sits. The cloud shadows sit this way towards blue a little bit in the blue-violet range. And because there's some yellow and other elements of the atmospheric perspective, it's not sitting on the outside of the color wheel, but inside a little bit. So these colors would be somewhere between blue and violet, some variation on blue-violet, bending more towards violet, and then in and grayed down a little bit within the color wheel. That's an important distinction to make from the sky color itself. Generally speaking, our cloud colors have more red in them than the blue of the sky. So the sky, we're sitting over here just a little bit to the left of blue. Our cloud would be even further to the left, maybe not all the way to violet, but maybe somewhere in this range right here. The sky is a little bit more saturated. It's not sitting on the outside. For us to make a sky color that sits way out here, we'd have to add just white and blue, but then it'd have no unity with the rest of the piece. So we're going to add a little red and a little yellow into it, but we're going to keep it out here for the most part. Fairly saturated color that just happens to be tinted down, and some variation on blue-violet. And then the cloud color itself going a little bit more towards violet, having a little bit more red in it, but a little bit further into the color wheel as well. Okay. The other thing I'd like to talk about with regard to clouds are the planes, the value planes. So you have a light side, you have what I call the halftone edge, and then this halftone face of the cloud. It's this plane that actually faces towards us, and then the underside of the cloud. And what I like to do is usually put my paint on with a diagonal brush stroke for the lights, because it's angling up at a diagonal towards the sunlight. I actually use somewhat of a loose vertical stroke for the face of the cloud, and then a horizontal stroke for in the side of the cloud, so that what we're doing is we're actually helping to sculpt the cloud with our paint stroke, and so helping the form along a little bit. Okay, let's go ahead actually and just draw on the cloud real quick. See, so I'm starting right here, I'm going up. Looks like it goes up at an angle a little bit and then comes down, comes in, angles this way. This part sits a little bit further this way than that. Looks like it bumps up a little bit. That's this side of the cloud, down. It's a horizontal underside of the cloud, and it comes to right about, if this is the edge of the cloud here, the underside sits to the right of it, maybe right about there. I'm going to drop this down a little bit. It jogs, showing that this cloud is actually sitting in front of that one by a little ways. As I bring this light up, I'm right about on track, because this shadow part of that cloud comes right about there. The point of this sits a little bit to the right of the left edge of the shadow of the cloud behind it. So in general terms, that's what we have for a shape. Now I'm just dealing with the contour. I haven't talked yet about the interior of the cloud. Okay. Next thing I want to observe is what I call light or shadow dominance. So on this back cloud here, it's shadow dominant because you see we have a larger shape of shadow there and a smaller shape of light there. This is a larger shape of shadow here and a smaller shape of light there. But on this cloud, it's a larger shape of light and a smaller shape of shadow. What we want to avoid all the time with our clouds, with our trees, is getting things to be symmetrical or half and half. We don't want half light and half shadow. We want to keep it as either dominant light or dominant shadow. So knowing that, I'm going to come along this area right here. So all this is going to be shadow, and this part here is going to be light for the most part. And when I come up here, that part is going to be light. You can see how this is narrower than this part. And in so doing, I'm kind of keeping the asymmetry going in my shapes and forms. When I come over here, see, that'd be a mistake to try and divide the shadow and the light there. And since I've already determined that this has a larger light than shadow, I'm going to move it off to the left a little bit where the shadow begins so that all this is light and that's shadow. So fundamental things is to make our measurements, compare when dealing with the contour of our clouds, just make some vertical alignments. It's really easy. Okay, that sits to the left of that. This jogs down a little bit. This comes at an angle, but this point right here is to the right of the edge of the cloud, that sort of thing. And then when we go to the interior of the cloud, we want to basically divide our cloud up asymmetrically again and try to make it either light or shadow dominant. I want to observe that right off the bat. All right, I'm going to go ahead and mix up the light side of my cloud. You can see here I'm getting a good amount of paint out of my well there because I know that there's going to be a lot of light to cover. So I don't want to just kind of keep dabbing into my white pile and just, it's kind of painful to paint that way. I might as well, if I know it's going to be all light, I'm just going to go ahead and mix up some color, maybe bend it a little red in a couple of places, right there. So I got varying colors to the light side of my clouds. I've added yellow to warm it up a little bit. As I mentioned, I want to kind of get the feeling of the sunlight. Even when it's not late in the afternoon, we're still going to have some temperature to it, even in noonday. In order to get the appearance of the warm sunlight, we really have to add a little bit of yellow into our light side of our subject matter. Here, see, I'm going to bring the light all the way over and make a larger shadow on this side. I notice that there's a temperature shift a little bit for the clouds on this side. It looks like to me it's going just a hair bit warmer. So I might initiate a little bit of that right now. Don't have to. There's always time to come in and correct. But I have subordinate light, dominant shadow, dominant light, subordinate shadow. The next thing I do, which is kind of a critical step, is I come in and I mix up my halftone edge. My halftone edge is that soft edge transition between the shadow and the light. So on this one right here, you can see this halftone extends all the way down over here. It's not quite in light, it's not quite in shadow, but just kind of a mixture of the two. Here we can see it's obviously in light, there is obviously in shadow, but right in between is that lighter value than the shadow, but the darker value than the light. What I want to do on my palette is to mix up that value and bring it right up next to my light. Now, we've already talked about before that the shadow color tends more violet when the light is yellow. And the easiest way I found to paint clouds and make those transitions is to keep the halftone, this edge right here, fairly close in value to the light. It can go a little bit darker, But what ends up happening is if I keep it close, look at how easy the transition is to make that soft edge going from the shadow to the light. Right? I'm not doing hardly any rendering at all, not having to belabor it, just laying it down there. And I'm going to kind of address this entire edge as it butts up against the light really quickly while I have the paint in my brush, and just kind of create a soft edge as it transitions along the cloud right there. It takes a little bit of practice, but with practice this actually starts to come easier and easier. Same here, soft edge transition. Just like that. Okay. And then I'll mix up my darker areas of my shadow. So I'm still moving across my palette. I'm kind of keeping my gradations organized. See, I don't want to mix back into these piles because next time I want to go mix up a halftone, I have no frame of reference to look for. But right now, if I need to mix up a halftone that goes, say, a little darker or lighter than what I have up here, I can just mix it up a little darker or lighter than what I have on my palette because it's already keyed there for me. Okay. So the darker areas of my shadow, maybe going a little bit too dark at that point, add a little bit more light back into it. It's a pretty dark cloud, the shadow side. I think we still have it a little dark right now. I'll lighten it up just a little bit more. Notice I'm not bringing this all the way over to here. I want that halftone edge, the value for my halftone right up against the light. I'm going to mix my shadow. If I have to lighten it, adjust the color, the temperature, I'm going to do it over here, away from that edge. So I always have that key available to me. To go back to and dip into and pull more of it out if I need it. So see, now look at how easily the shadow transitions into the halftone. And as I mentioned before, I'm kind of using a vertical stroke to indicate the face of my cloud. So you lay that dark down, and soften it as it comes up to the halftone. I'm not trying to bring the shadow up against the light. I'm just bringing the shadow up against the halftone edge because that halftone edge is already established against the light right now. Now, over here, I'm going to go one step darker for the underside of my cloud. And I'm going to use a horizontal stroke to indicate that bottom edge. Maybe add a little yellow into it to grade it down a little bit. I don't want this thing reading too sharp or purple. So lay that down. This goes a little bit lower by comparison. So I go reach back into my halftone or maybe wipe off my brush, and I just softly transition up the edge of my underside of my cloud here too. It's actually fairly effortless when we have these values mixed ahead of time and understanding what is it we're trying to accomplish in terms of the form. See, I'm coming back in with a halftone. I'm not trying to blend my shadow up into the light. I come in with my halftone edge to make those transitions. And it makes it go super easy that way. Fairly effortless. See, these are halftones within the lights that I'm putting in there. If that edge right there is too abrupt, just soften it. Bring in some halftone. Again, I'm not trying to bring that halftone down towards the base of the shadow. I want the shadow to go into a lighter shadow here. Now I'm going to come back in with a few of the lights that are on the larger shadow of the cloud there. So it looks like there's a little bit of a light right there that jogs this way, and then there's a pretty good shape of light right there. I'm just putting it down as a shape initially, and then I'm going to come back in and adjust the edge a little bit to show that it's form falling from light or it's an overlap. So once I put the shape down, come into my halftone color right there, and I just soften the edge a little bit. So transitions. If I see some halftone mingling through the light side of the cloud, I come over here to my halftone area on my palette. And it's really the type of thing that I can work endlessly on. Now, with oils, there's some things that's easier and some things that's more difficult. One, it's harder to make corrections because the paint stays wet, but it's a whole lot easier to get our edges that way than with the acrylics. Acrylics have to kind of work at it a little bit more in order to initiate some of my softer edges. See, because the paint has a tendency to dry on me, whereas with the oils, it'll stay nice and wet for us. I don't want this transition to become too abrupt, so I reach into my lights. See, it still has a little bit of the halftone color in my brush. And I'll come over the top and I'm not exactly rendering the cloud that I'm seeing. I'm just kind of getting a general idea of what it's doing in terms of its form, and then making an abbreviation of it in paint. Okay, now let's put in the sky, okay? Because it's hard to even read the cloud until it's got that nice contrast with the sky. I'm reading the sky as being a little bit darker than even the shadow of the cloud. You can see up here that the shadow of the cloud looks like it reads a little bit light. Right here you can really tell it reads a little bit of light against the darker value of the sky. And right here on my palette, I'm comparing my shadow to the value of the sky. Now, I know I set the sky as mostly more blue than the shadow of the cloud, but I'm still not just going to use blue and white. I find that doesn't work very well for a sky. It doesn't have any harmonizing properties. So I'll add a little bit of red and a little bit of yellow in, not nearly as much red as what I'm seeing in the cloud, because I want there to be a temperature change between the two. You can see how this is a little bit more gray, has a little bit more red and yellow in it, and that stays a little bit more pure into the outside of the color wheel. So not only is there a change in saturation, the sky sits a little bit further out and the cloud shadow sits a little further in, but there's a hue change, a temperature change. The cloud is actually over here going more towards violet, whereas the sky over here is blue-violet, but bending a little bit more towards blue. I'm just filling in the sky right now really quickly. And that's kind of how I establish my initial lay-in of value and color with regards to clouds. There's not a ton of nuance to it right now. When we get to the actual demo, I'll talk about finishing touches and things that we can do to take it from this stage to feeling like a little bit more of a complete painting. But for right now, I think we're just going to just illustrate these basic ideas. And I want to kind of recap right now some of the things that we've just talked about. So just going to show you one more thing. You can see right here where the cloud goes in a little darker. I'm going to reach over here to where my darker part of my shadow is. Put a little bit of it in. Now, rather than spread that out, I'll reach over here into my lighter part of my cloud and help make that transition go a little bit more smoothly. Now I can get that nice dark in there and have it transition out without actually trying to drag the dark into these other areas, which sometimes is a little bit of a difficult proposition. You can do that anywhere. See right here, if I want to go in here and make that a little darker, and begin to develop our cloud that way. Okay, let's go ahead and recap, shall we? It's important to understand where these colors are with regard to the color wheel, because it gives our minds a visual understanding of how to mix our colors in order to get to that place on the palette. This blue of the sky sits over here near blue, but it's a little bit more blue-violet than that. And it's sitting to the outside of the color wheel because it's a little bit more saturated. The cloud itself actually is a little bit more red, moving not all the way towards violet, but maybe it's still blue-violet, but certainly has more red in it than the blue of the sky. And it also has some yellow to gray it down and bring it into the color wheel. So the sky color sits in here, the shadow color of the cloud sits here, the blue of the sky sits here. We have some yellow mixed in with the white, sits way out here with a bunch of white in it. The sky itself is for the most part blue-violet, but as it came down towards the horizon, I started to add yellow into it, so it started bringing it a little bit more towards blue-green. Now let's talk about the shapes within our cloud. We want to either be dominant light or dominant shadow every time. On this side, we have dominant light. Even though there's some halftones coming through the cloud, there's not enough of it to where it's changing this from light to shadow. For the most part, the light reads all the way right here, and the shadow reads here. If it starts to get too half and half, I'll go ahead and bring my light a little bit over to continue creating an asymmetrical relationship between the light and shadow side. On this side of the cloud, though, it's dominant shadow and subordinate light. And I was careful to make sure I understood that, recognized it, and put it down that way from the very beginning. People always ask me, well, how do I paint faster? Or how do I abbreviate? How do I get my brushstroke looking a little bit more quickly? A lot of it has to do with our understanding of design. Because the small light and the large shadow is, among other things, a product of design. We have to kind of recognize that right off the bat. The transition from the lights of the cloud into the shadow is very important. It's what I call halftone edge. It's this edge that bounces along here. And on my palette, I basically want to mix up a color that is just a little bit cooler than the light of the sky, but not much darker at all. See how these values right here next to the sky are fairly close? And I want to lay that in first and then reach over here where I've got my darker shadow, and then I want to bring my shadow value in as it moves up against this other cloud over here. And I want to do it in such a way that I'm generally going vertical with my brush stroke. I'm kind of going diagonal with my lights, vertical with my shadows, and then when I get to the underside of my cloud, I'm hitting with the horizontal. Hopefully that is helpful as we move into the demo, which we're going to do right now. Okay, so getting started with our demo. Put a red dot in the center as always to mark the very center of my composition and make sure I don't have anything tangent, anything too symmetrical. And putting in some drawing into the foreground, you can see that in the photograph there's areas that are a little bit lighter, a little bit darker. They're not arbitrary. I really do try to give some consideration as to where I put things, and usually use a little bit of perspective, some diminution, some convergence in order to help depict the foreground, because I always feel the foreground needs to function in some way, for the design, rather than just sit there. Have it lead in, have it do something to help with the design. A lot of times what I'm doing here when I'm putting in these red marks is I'll put a dot down, and folks will ask me, what are those dots for? A lot of times what they're doing is they're just marking an approximation of a place where I think something needs to go. Here, if I'm putting in the edge of the cloud, a lot of times I'm looking at the negative space, not actually at the cloud, but at the negative space behind it in order to draw the cloud. And what that does is it helps me to become more objective in what I'm seeing, as opposed to trying to put down what I think I see. So that's a case where, the old adage, draw what we see, not what we know. Just trying to look very objectively at this point, at this beginning point, as we're establishing the spacing and the basic breakup of the space on the picture plane. A light yellow wash, really nice to tone the canvas a little bit if some of those warmer tones come through in areas that I don't cover the canvas completely with the painting. Those little warm tones always have a tendency to feel more natural to the landscape. And here I'm putting in some lights of the cloud. You notice that as we had a shot of the palette just a second before, that I added a little bit of yellow into the white of the cloud. We talked a little bit about that in the education part of the webinar that we've just done. Even in a noonday situation or a fairly cool sunlight, like hazy light, or right in the middle of the day where the light goes a little cooler, I'll still add a little bit of yellow into my lights to keep them a little bit warmer and give the warm feeling of the sun. You can see here I'm mixing my halftone. Notice how easily that transitions on the palette. Now when I bring it up to my painting, you can see that edge right between the light and the dark is very soft, and the transitions happen very easily. And it took me a while to figure that one out, but it's such a huge step. I used to try and put in the shadows and then try to render or blend the shadows into the light. And the process was cumbersome, difficult to be able to achieve the type of soft transitions that I was looking for. I have to fight with the paint all the time. Here, if I keep the value of my halftone fairly close, you can see there on my palette, it's fairly close to the light. I find that that transition between those edges, between where it meets the light and moves up into the light, almost effortless. See how just a couple of strokes and it blends right away. And those really capture the character a lot of times of the cumulus cloud, other types of clouds as well where we have softer transitions. There I've added a little bit of burnt sienna into the mixture, just grays down that shadow a little bit more. Unlike the illustration we had done in the lecture part of this webinar, these clouds, the shadows are a lot grayer, a lot more neutral than what we used before. I didn't really dip into the burnt sienna in the illustration, but here I've dipped a little bit into the burnt sienna to try and get the burnt sienna, and the ultramarine blue actually makes a really good neutral tone. And because these clouds are a little bit more neutral, what I mean by that is that the saturation is a little closer in towards the center of the color wheel. I'm just getting, basically what I'm using is a muted warm with a saturated cool. The saturated cool is the ultramarine blue, the muted warm is the burnt sienna, and it just gets me into the color wheel a little bit more. It gets me some of these neutral tones that we have on these particular clouds to this day. Here I'm using a vertical stroke to indicate the face, the halftone face of the cloud. You can see that that painting it vertically helps to establish that frontal plane pretty nicely. It's not that everything has to be vertical, it's just a general vertical movement to the brush stroke. And I find a lot of times that helps with the form and to help sculpt the shape of the cloud with the direction of the brush stroke. Very useful. Same thing here. I'm down near the bottom underside of the cloud. I'm using more of a horizontal stroke, and that horizontal stroke is there to help establish that plane that's underneath the form here. Blending edges, so just dragging the paint over that undershadow that I've established, and just have it be soft as it transitions up. Now this is dark accent value and color. I'm not actually painting the shadow just yet. The way I do my trees is I like to hit my dark accent first, and you can see that it's bending a little bit towards a muted violet. The trees in this case are blue-green. I'll come over the top of that dark accent color with the blue-greens. I don't know where the shape of the dark accents are supposed to go just yet. It'd be impossible for me to try and put them in as little accents, so I just paint the whole thing for the trees with a dark accent. The dark accent color, which is down around about an 8 value. It's really quite dark. And then later on, I'll come back over the top of it with my shadow color, the shadow defined as that subject matter out of the sunlight, but receiving lots of secondary light, such as from the sky or from reflected light off the ground. The dark accents defined as those areas where very little to no secondary light is able to penetrate, so it goes a step darker. Okay, moving back up to the cloud here. I'm just working edges, working shape. I'm basically viewing my cloud in 3 planes: the light, the halftone, and the shadow. And I'll organize my palette this way. See how that gradation's going from dark to light? And I'll keep it that way the entire process that I'm painting the sky. Here I'm mixing up my sky color in the usual place that I mix it up on my palette. In the video here, it's in the upper right corner, but as I'm looking at my palette, it's in my lower right corner. And notice that I'm creating varying ranges of colors. See, it's more blue in the center there, it's more red over to the left, and then I put a little bit of yellow up towards the right. And that'll just help me vary my color in my sky. Last thing I want to do is to have a sky that is one color, particularly if it's just blue and white paint. It just doesn't seem to harmonize very well with the rest of the piece. You can see here that the sky is definitively blue. It's not blue. It's blue violet, but hasn't gotten to violet yet on the color wheel. And yet I still have some of the other 2 primaries in there. How can I do that? Put the other 2 primaries and still have it read like a sunny blue sky. It's just a matter of degrees. So there I'm bending the color a little bit warmer. You can see it's a little bit red in that upper left, and then now I'm going back towards blue. As it moves down, I'll probably add some yellow, which is what skies usually do, is they have a tendency to, a lot of times, blue-green towards the horizon. And I'm just going to vary my color quite a bit here because it's a big space. You don't want there to be one color. See, there's that yellow. And this is what I mean by varying our color. We're moving it around so that there's interest through the variety. And we don't really necessarily want to ever paint anything. First of all, mix our skies with blue and white usually does not work very well. It doesn't harmonize. It's too chromatic. And so I throw a little bit of the other primaries in there. I just make sure that I don't put too much of it and turn it into an overcast sky. But if I put a little red and a little bit of yellow, but it's primarily blue and white, then I get the best of both worlds. Still looks like a sunny afternoon, clear blue sky, but at the same time, it has some harmony with the rest of the piece, with the rest of the surroundings, because it has some of the colors of the rest of the surroundings, if that makes sense. Little bits of blue sky within the clouds is always nice. It trickles down that element, if you will, that motif, into the mass of the sky and helps to break it up a little bit, make it not feel so solid. Here I'm going to be mixing up my mountain color. Now, one thing to keep in mind, I've been outdoors a lot over the years, and I have never seen, and I've looked for it too, a case where the underside of the cloud is darker than the shadow it casts on the mountain below it. Now, it's not that it couldn't happen, I've just never seen it. And so the stereotype is that the shadow on the mountain goes a step darker than the sky, and you can see that I'm already establishing that here. If you compare the underside of that cloud, which is fairly dark, it actually is already in the middle of the value scale, probably around a 5. But this mountain here is one step darker by comparison. And that's right where I want it. I've also got a lot of blue in there. It's fairly muted. And what that all does, cooling it and graying it down, helps to push those things back in space. Now I'm mixing the light side of my mountain. See, it's where the sun hits. And two things have to happen here. One is there's got to be a contrast in value. The value has to contrast from dark to light. But just as important, in order to really give a good illustration of the sunlight to shadow effect, there's got to be a contrast in temperature as well. So we can see that where the mountain hits the light, or rather where the light hits the mountain, the color has gone from dark to light and from warm to cool. Actually, from cool to warm, if we're talking about the shadow first. See, I'm still keeping the color fairly warm. What that's going to mean is that I'm going to indicate a patch of light on the ground in the distance. And where the value goes darker and goes cooler is where the shadow pattern will begin on the ground plane. See, warms and cools are relative. In another painting or compared to another area, we might consider this a warm color. But like we've talked about before, the components that make a shadow are three things. One, it is the local color of the subject which the shadow is falling upon. It's the complement of the light source which our eyes generate to find equilibrium. And it's any type of secondary light that we see outdoors. The prominent one outdoors would be the skylight. And so all three of those components we find within the shadow, but the one that I'm talking about right now specifically is the local color. So if the ground is really warm, so we have deciduous type grasses, they may gray down to this warm color right here. That does have blue in it and some white. And so that mixture will create a cooler version of that warm subject matter. It's the local color really affecting the temperature of our light and shadow. You see, just like the sky, where we have a large area, really the last thing I want to do is to keep that color going, extending too far. So I'm going to put some cools back in and just vary the tone a little bit between warm and cool, a little bit more saturated, a little bit more gray. I am careful about my foregrounds. I want to see them perform a certain function, and so a lot of times the value, the spacing, the shapes that we see in there are well considered. See, there's a little light patch here where the ground goes a little lighter, and I want to think about how big that patch is, the shape of it compared to everything else. You can see that the area below it is larger than the area above it. You know, those warm tones below that light patch and that above it, it's larger below and smaller above. Well, that is a product of perspective that I want to basically utilize to my advantage in helping to carry the viewer's eye ultimately into the piece. And perspective always, very, very useful for doing that. So even at this early stage of the block-in, I'm still thinking about design. You know, as I'm putting in the lights for the trees here, I'm thinking about, is it going to be light dominant or shadow dominant? I want it to break up asymmetrically. This is that shadow color that I was talking about earlier, and softening the edges as it meets the background, putting some of that shadow over the initial dark accent that I used to define the shape of the tree initially. And coming in from in back and putting in some of the negative spaces within the hill back there. There are some areas that are lighter, some areas that are darker. It's all the same sunlight on that subject matter. What's changing is the local color of the ground plane below it. So if we use a common color for the light, in this case it's some variation on yellow or yellow-orange, and apply that to all the various elements up there, what we're going to get an effect of a hill that looks like it's changing in color but under the same light source, which is great because it unifies everything, makes it feel very cohesive. Notice I'm really using the edge of my brush, the side of it, to create nice thin markings as things go back in space. As they recede, they get smaller. So I'm using a lot the side of my brush to indicate the careful detail that we see in the divots and the imperfections in the ground and the changes in color and the variations that are back there. Very soft, very subtle, very delicate. It requires kind of a sensitive, delicate approach, particularly as we move back in space, because now we're having to soften edges and do all those things that create the illusion of distance, right? So let's see, just little things to help with the illusion of space. You notice that front grouping of trees on the left side is dominant light. See, I've replaced a lot of the dark accent and have come over it with sunlight that's hitting the face of the tree. The only thing that I don't want to do, it could be dominant shadow. I think it's mostly arbitrary. But the thing I don't want to do is to break those tree shapes up, and for that matter, the clouds as well. I don't want to break them up half and half and get things going too symmetrical. So I'm going to be careful about that as I put in my light and shadow patterns to make sure that they stay uneven and one remains dominant, the other subordinate. Little cast shadow under the tree. Don't know that I saw it that prominently in the photograph, but really helps to create the effect, just that little cast shadow underneath there of the sunlight landing on our subject matter. I'm always amazed at how, little subtle minor things make such a difference to the overall effect of a scene, of our subject matter. Using my finger, sometimes nothing can really replace a finger for softening an edge. It has just the right feel. And one thing about the contour of clouds is that I like to vary the edge quite a bit. So if I have an area where the cloud moves up from the lower part of the composition or the middle part of the composition all the way up towards the top, what I usually like to do is to vary that edge and lose and find it. So it'll go sharp and it'll go soft, it'll go sharp and it'll go soft as it moves up. It just creates a nice effect, creates variety. And as we continue on with the rendering of these clouds, I'll do more of that. Right now, I'm working on the interior. See, softening edges where the cloud rolls from light to shadow. Still thinking about those three planes, the light, the halftone, and the shadow areas, and utilizing the direction of my brush stroke to help with the form, along with softening these edges. Softening those edges as they transition from that shadow underneath up into the lighter
areas of shadow and into those halftones. See, I'm just softening those edges as they come up out of the shadow and into the halftone area. But you notice that I stay away from the edge where the halftone meets the light. I don't bring the shadow all the way up there. The deeper shadow blends into the halftone, and then the halftone blends into the light. Is basically how this works. So, what we're seeing right now is a transition in the process also. I usually like to block in my entire painting before I start worrying about things like little details, adjusting the shape, adjusting value, edge, all that sort of stuff. And we're now at the end of the block-in stage. One of the things that I try to achieve during the block-in and before I move into the stage that I'm in right now, which is the adjustment stage, is to try and get the values and the saturation and the color fairly close. It's not perfect. It'll never be perfect in the block-in stage because we'll do things after the block-in that'll help develop the nuance and the subtlety, refinement of the painting. But what we'd like to do is just see the basic relationships, and we see that here. We see that the mount's partly in light, partly in shadow. Same thing with the ground plane. We see the positioning of the trees. We see the value of the trees, that the light side of the tree is darker than the ground plane. All those relationships are in place initially, and what that does is give us a little bit of a roadmap by which we can make further adjustments as we move into the next stages. And so right now, we've established the block-in, the basic composition. We've established a sense of the light direction, light quality, the time of day. All that right now can be gotten during the block-in stage, and it's one of the objectives that we want to try and accomplish as we work to establish the fundamentals of the design of the elements. And now, see, as I work and I soften and I develop the subtle nuances of the shape, I can do so within the framework of that original block-in. I'll make all my adjustments within those value and saturation ranges that was established initially. So that's really super useful. You can see I'm putting in some violets now. Some of those violets are there to help create distance, just lightening up a little bit the shadow on the mountain, but I'm careful to make sure that the mountain overall stays darker than the underside of the cloud. So I'm kind of keeping my eye on all these things and all these relationships as I proceed forward in the painting. Sometimes I'm asked, well, what do we do after the block-in? A student might ask me, well, I don't exactly know where to go from here. There's so many things that we can do after the block-in stage to develop form, to adjust value, shape, edges. And it really, this part of the process takes up most of the time in the painting. And there's a lot of going back and forth. I'll put down a color, I'll put down a shape. I may not like it, I'll change it. I might like it and keep it. This is a stage where a lot of times the happy accidents happen and something that I didn't plan on or try to accomplish, but I'll recognize it as, oh, that actually looks really neat, that color or that shape or that relationship, and then I'll begin to keep things. And by and by, finish off a painting that way. Someone once said it's not what you leave in, it's what you leave out that makes a good painting. And I think that's true a lot of times because it allows us to participate and not have everything spelled out to us. And this stage of adjustment, this third stage of the painting is very much for that. Like I said, developing the nuances that make for a more finished look, a more finished painting. varying a little bit the color. I had blue down there before, now I'm bringing some greens over. Notice I'm trying to get as much variation as possible, thickening up the brush stroke, which is varying the color. Notice also that just because it's a foreground ground plane doesn't mean I have to use my brush strokes in a horizontal direction. I see that a lot of times with water and with ground planes in front. I mean, we already have a rectangle down there. The last thing I want to do is to reinforce that rectangle with all horizontal strokes. And so I'll vary them. I'll have variation to shape, color, edge. And for me, the process of doing a foreground like this, which is fairly abstract, is I take certain cues from the reference. There may be a light patch or something, but a lot of times I'll lay a color down and I'll move my brush stroke around. And then I have to look to see what got put down. And then that'll allow me to go to the next step and respond to that. And so it's a very intuitive process, I think, painting abstract elements like, sand on a beach, foregrounds where you have random patterns of grasses and dirt's growing, grasses growing and dirt clusters and divots. And it's a matter, I don't follow the photograph 100%. I just look at the painting and think, okay, it needs maybe a little bit of cooler color here as it brings it across. I might gain inspiration from the reference for some of this, but a lot of it is just made up, and it's based on what I call the principle of aesthetics. That is, that variety equals interest in art, and so I'm looking for passages where I can find variety to the shape, the color, to the edge, and it's a very abstract process, and it trains our eye. It really does, to be able to see things and to appreciate very, very subtle relationships in variety, in variation within our painting. And the more painting we do and the more we embark on this process, the better we develop our eye for seeing these things. I really do think that a lot of our growth comes from the development of our eye over time as we begin to see these relationships. I mean, initially we have to understand the fundamentals. Like I put those darks in there on that left side, putting some darks in here, and I'll generally soften the edges. See, there it goes, soften the edges right up into the light, because that is a product of form. So we have to learn these fundamentals first, but once we have these really a finite number of fundamentals down, now it's how we put it together and how we organize the painting that allows it to be, satisfying visually to us and registers correctly when we look at our paintings and make the decision process of what shape where and how to handle our subject matter. We just develop more sensitivity as time goes on. The reason why I'm talking about all this is that you may reach a point where you understand these principles. We reach that point where we understand them, and yet the results we get are still not where we want them to be. I think that never changes because our eye is always ahead of our ability, but by and by what happens is the product starts to look better and better. And that's just a process that takes time. And so, we be patient with it, and might as well just enjoy the process as we go along and improve over time. See, I've brought a lot of light onto the tops of the trees now. Now I'm going to put a few highlights. I've already established the light side of the tree. Now I'm just going to put a few highlights on. And the highlights are, they really are a delicate issue, because if we put them on too crisp, they just read like little polka dots sitting on top of our subject matter. They actually have to go in there, not blend too much in with the light that's underneath, but have enough soft edge to them that they merge and they unify with the subject matter. And so there's a delicate process, really delicate process to establishing and placing those highlights. down once we've established the light side of our subject matter. The light side of our subject matter is comprised of basically two components, the light and the highlights, and they're both separate entities of the light side of our subject. Going in and changing temperature, changing edges, establishing some shape. There's a little shape of light, softening the edge as it comes down into the shadow a little bit. See, there's a light on the left side. It's going to be soft as it transitions into that shadow. On the right side, it's going to be sharp edge as it's abrupt and change in plane as it overlaps the area that's next to it there. Soft transitions, altering color, creating detail. These are all the products of the third stage of our painting, where we've already done our block in. Now we're going to go back into the cloud, and we're going to see little shapes of light, little changes in color, temperature. I mean, it really fundamentally boils down to the same 3 or 4 things. Basically a shape with either a soft or hard edge in a certain color and in a certain place. And we just go back and forth between the sky and the ground plane. And taking my time developing everything. Really not in much of a rush, just wanting to be very much in the process as I paint. Training my eye to see, developing my senses for good aesthetics. As a part of that intuitive process that I was talking about, putting the stroke down, altering the color, using my best sense to determine what to do with all this. And it's based on several principles. Notice that the diagonal brush strokes are converging as they go back in space. Well, that is a principle of perspective, that things converge. So I'm applying a little bit of that, but a lot of it is really just made up and, fairly intuitive as I make my way through some of these more abstract areas of the painting, like the foreground. Moving back up into the sky and deepening the shadow for the underside now. Sometimes it's hard to tell just how far to go until we get some of the ground plane elements established a little bit better. And just delicately softening the edges as it transitions into the shadow, the halftone. And so working back and forth a little bit, I'm going to continue to go back and forth between the ground plane elements and the sky right now. But just rendering the shadows and trying to get them to transfer and transition upwards into those halftones a little bit more smoothly. I can see a couple areas on here where you could use for a little bit more finesse. So really one of the things that I like to do as I'm developing the subject matter is to develop those subtle transitions in shape and in edge, helping to develop the form. Here I'm bringing a little bit of the sky color down into the ground plane. Again, really hard to tell what to do with the sky until the ground plane has a little bit more unity with it. And so really we are composing the painting as opposed to just, painting it piecemeal. We really want to be able to see the thing kind of come together into a cohesive whole. And part of its color, part of its shape. Here's some detail in the midground trees. This is part of finishing up the painting as well, as to start to show the transitions from foreground, middle ground to background. Doesn't need a whole lot of detail in the far distance. A lot of times just a couple of strokes, a couple of indication of trees, perhaps spaced in a nice asymmetrical way is all we need to describe the narrative of the subject matter back there in the distance. Here I'm lowering the distant trees a little bit more. Always felt that the foreground trees, the middle ground trees, and the background trees were kind of grouping together. And so lowering those distant trees, along with putting less detail for that further row of trees, that along with the size differences are helping to illustrate the movement back in space and the diminution of that subject matter as they recede. And come back up and working the sky again, softening edges, adjusting the value, adjusting the color. Notice the edge now against the top of the mountain's a little bit softer. It's way off to the right-hand side of the picture. I'm not sure I really want to have a hard edge over there. Lightening up some of the light of the ground plane back there so that the light and shadow, pops a little bit better. Here I'm mixing up a value and laying it down to represent the shadow side of the trees as they roll up the hill. See, I've just hit a couple of small little individual trees. And again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, sometimes that's all it needs. It's just a couple of indications and nothing too much to overdo it for the subject matter way in the distance. Okay, now I'm going to come back in. I've kind of held off on hitting the value in the sky, mainly because we really don't know how much emphasis to place on something until we build up the painting. And we can see now in the ground plane lots of activity. Actually, I've put quite a bit more variations to the ground plane in front of the trees, and the trees themselves are quite strong. All of it kind of draws my eye a little bit from the clouds, which is the motif of the painting. And so now that I've got those established, I want to go back up here, darken the sky, and really get the clouds to punch a little bit more in contrast. So just careful about my edges as I go along the edge of the cloud. Some areas soft, some areas a little softer, a little sharper, and redefining some of these shapes down here. Varying my brush stroke in the sky. A lot of it's moving vertical up and down. This area right here where the two clouds meet, I'm putting in some of the negative shapes of the clouds, of the sky. And what it equates to, a lot of the detail work that we're doing here is stronger eye candy in an area that's important. There's some directional line from both these clouds leading down into this area, and so I want to kind of increase the activity there. I've established a lot of the large and medium-sized light shapes throughout the clouds. Now I'm working on some of the smaller ones there. These small shapes of light and dark create a certain amount of activity that draws our eye. And so as I continue to work this area, I'm going to develop a little bit more of these types of accents of small lights and darks. Some of these wispy clouds up here in the sky. Now we're going to put those in. And I mean, the subject matter are wispy clouds, but from a design standpoint, what it does is it goes from the top of that light cloud on the right to sky, now back to some lighter wispy clouds, back to dark sky. And so there's actually more activity, more eye candy. And sometimes we just don't know how much of this to put in until we have the composition develop far enough in order to compare. See, I only want to put enough up there to make sure that it's stronger than the ground plane, but not much stronger than that. We don't want it to overpower the painting, but we need it to be stronger than what we have down in the ground, because the sky is the motif of the painting. Here I'm adding a little chroma to that middle ground. Is going to bring that forward a little bit of that area just in back of it. I'm going to leave that area just in back of it a little bit darker, as though it's a shadow. See that soft edge at the top of that shadow against the light in the very distance is fairly soft and not a lot of detail back there. And so hitting some of the chroma and some of the detail in that middle ground, continues to help with the illusion and consistency of the space receding. Another thing that I always noticed with this was that the counterbalance of this tree on the right side was a little strong. It was drawing too much attention. So I'm going to cut in on it, soften its edges, and maybe work the form, work the contour a little bit, and just get that tree shape a little bit softer on that right side, maybe function a little bit better as a counterbalance. I'm just using the negative space of the hill behind to carve in on it. It's never really good to have a light end and not reappear on the other side of something, especially if it's an element that goes all the way through. So putting some of these lights shows a little bit of a continuation of that light in that distant middle ground, and it helps to bring balance to the piece by trickling out the lights across to the left side, not just ending abruptly there in the center. Softening the edges of this tree a little bit, and developing just some subtle nuances to that subject matter, bringing in some lights on that left-hand side, hitting the detail in the foreground, increasing the contrast. So I'm expanding the value range right now. Why is that good? Because what that does is it makes that part of the ground feel like it's closer than the midground, which I added more chroma to just a little while ago. Here's an important step, putting down some grays on top of the trees. And what that does is help to unify with the sky, number one. Number two, it helps to turn the form of the tree. We're basically saying as the form turns up towards the sky, that the skylight coming down will begin to influence the color. And so, a very effective technique for addressing the tops of our trees. I hope that you can see from the way we've worked this painting how it really is a composition. It's composing a painting. What we do in the sky, it's not just a demo or a webinar about how to render a cloud, even though we talked a lot about that. But ultimately, it's how the cloud relates to the entire scene. And so in synopsis, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the principles we've discussed. Okay, and so we've talked about 3 planes of a cloud, that there's a light side, there's a halftone, and then there's a darker shadow underneath. And I've illustrated and demoed how I've organized my palette to reflect these 3 planes, and hopefully that has been something that's been useful and helpful to you. We've talked about the cloud color. So even at noonday or in the middle of the day, if it's sunlight on there, I generally tend to put in a little bit of yellow to warm up the color in the light side. Nothing colder than a white cloud painted with white paint. And the temperature on the shadow side also needs to be considered, usually grayer and bending more towards violet than the blue of the sky. The blue sky could be blue-violet or true blue, even blue-green. And we'll see that the shadow is a little bit grayer and bending a little bit more towards red. This is useful in this particular painting. We can see that the shadow side is lighter than the sky. A lot of times we'll have a sky that's not this dark, and so the values get a little bit closer together. Is really useful to delineate the 2 different subject matter by color temperature. And then lastly, emphasis on the sky motif. So this is a really important point. I held off to the very end before I started hitting my small shapes. So there was a lot of medium and a lot of large shapes in both the light and the shadow. And as I developed the ground and saw how much emphasis there was down there, it allowed me to get to that place where I can then hit the clouds a little bit stronger. So I brought in some negative space of the sky, hit some small shapes, created activity, created emphasis, some eye candy in that area. When we're talking about a sky motif, it's very important from the very beginning to understand what our painting is. Is it about the sky? Is it about the ground? Because usually it can't be about both. Otherwise, the viewer gets confused as to where to look. And so once we've established and have gotten the painting to a certain point, now we can finish the sky by hitting certain accents and certain emphasis in a certain area. Hopefully this demo has been useful and you found some good information to help you with your sky paintings and your cloud paintings. And so now let's move on to the Q&A.